Okay, who is the host? Is that you, Kimberly, or Ashley?
I don't think I'm the host just yet. Or am I?
Do you see something that says interpretation in your menu?
No.
Okay, then it's probably not you. Hola Diana, ¿me puedes escuchar? Hola, es Grace, ¿cómo estás? Bien, gracias. Estoy ayudando hoy. Pues sí, pues sí, aquí andamos. Perdón, es que estaba leyendo lo del chat, me perdí un momento. Ok, solo estoy esperando a Carol para asignarla y ya me quedo atrás. Voy a devolverme al canal de inglés. Gracias. Yes, hello. Sí, Diana, dime. Sí, dile que le estoy tratando de enviar no, un correo con el link otra vez. Vamos a ver.
Okay, now.
Hola, Carol. Sí, ahora sí Diana, ¿estás ahí también? Perfecto. Diana, ¿me escucha? Ahora sí, perdón, es que ahorita no te escuché. Gracias. Carol, otra vez para verificar. Perfecto, muchas gracias. Ya voy a devolverle los derechos de host a Kimberly. Un momento.
When I previously shared my screen with y'all, were you able to see it?
Yes, we did.
Thank you.
Yes. Permissions and I was entering. Oh. Okay. Hey everyone. Welcome back to Take Root. Hey Ash, how are you? I hope everyone had a great break. Everyone had a great lunch. And I hope everyone just experienced some of the wonderful speakers and sessions that we've had, not just our breakout, but our morning sessions as well. So to start off our afternoon, I would like to welcome Ash Williams. Ash Williams is a doula who is a part of the Mountain Area Abortion Doula Collective, and he's gonna have some really great things to tell us today. So Ash, it is all yours. Take it away.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, y'all. I am just getting my screen ready to share here with y'all. I prepared a presentation to help me and to help y'all. Can y'all see my screen now? Yes, I can't see you all. Great, thank you for that feedback. I appreciate it. So happy to be with y'all here. I want to say thank you to Kimberly. I want to say thank you to the other organizers. I want to say thank you to the Kentucky Health Justice Network. Thanks for everyone who's here right now. Big shout out to all of the abortion funds and the reproductive justice organizers from the South. Big ups to y'all. So I'm gonna get started. So the first thing that I actually want to do is acknowledge the land. I really appreciate the organizers yesterday kicking us off by encouraging folks to find out what land you're on. For the last 5 years, I've been a part of this decolonial feminist politics workshop coming out of the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. And so I want to share this land acknowledgement as another way to reorient us. As many of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this land, it is our collective responsibility to pay respect and recognize that this land is the traditional territory of Cherokee Indigenous community. And we are here, I am here, because this land was occupied. In recognizing that this space occupies colonized Aboriginal territories, and out of respect for the rights of Aboriginal people, it is our collective responsibility to critically interrogate the colonial histories and present day implications of this, and to honor, protect, and sustain this land. And so if you've done a workshop with me, whether it be about decolonizing college campuses or abolishing the police or reproductive justice, the land recognition has been a part of my practice as a facilitator and as an organizer. And I'm really grateful to have that be a part of the practice. And I'm glad that it's here as a part of the conference as well. And so I've taken a moment to kind of step back to think about, why start from this place of decolonizing, right? So police violence is colonial violence. Reproductive oppression is also colonial violence. And so I have questions like, how can we include and work alongside stewards of the land? How can we undo colonial implications of punishment and reproductive oppression within our organizing work and within our campaigns? And how do our campaigns and policies address colonial violence? If so, I'm running with the assumption, right, that colonialism threatens bodily autonomy. And I'm also running with the assumption that understanding anti-Blackness and institutional racism is key. It is essential for understanding reproductive oppression. So I also have to start from this place of my reproductive justice story, right? So RJ, the framework asks all of us to start here. this political moment actually calls for us to share our stories of reproductive oppression, as well as how we celebrate ourselves and our communities while also navigating, right, white supremacist, cis heteropatriarchal systems, whether that be the medical industrial complex or the prison industrial complex. And so I want to start by sharing my RJ story. So at the time that I had my first abortion, I was already out as a non-binary trans person. I didn't have a lot of supportive Black community. And this was really important for me, like about to navigate this experience of having an abortion, never having had one before. I ended up asking white friends for money for the abortion. I also reached out to my local abortion fund, shout out to CAF, for money for both of my abortions. I spent two separate times, right, waiting during that 72-hour waiting period, one of the longest waiting periods in the country, to have both of my abortions. And that first time I had an abortion, I was really nervous about advocating for myself regarding my pronouns, regarding my gender identity. So no one asked me what my pronouns were at my appointment, at the multiple appointments that I had. I was nervous that if I said something about being trans and not using she and her pronouns, that I wouldn't be able to get the abortion. And so I was careful to like correct myself in getting the care that I came there to get, even if that meant I wouldn't be gendered appropriately or correctly. So at the time of my first abortion, the clinic that I went to, which ended up being the clinic that I went to for both of my abortions, right? This was a clinic that was seeing thousands of anti-abortion protesters weekly. There was also a heavy police presence at this clinic. So a couple years later, I would go on to do a Trans 101 for this clinic. And that was a really transformative experience for me as an organizer and as a person who actually had an abortion at that clinic. And essentially what I was trying to do was familiarize the folks who worked at the clinic with transgender identity, with pronouns, and kind of imagining what it might be like to not only address people in the clinic by the pronouns that they want, but also what it would be like to kind of educate folks about that along the way. So one of the things that I was doing kind of while I was having this kind of first abortion, right, is I was already fighting things like cis sexism, along reproductive oppression in my community as an organizer fighting House Bill 2, and also protesting against the police killing of people where I live. So for the first time, the folks who were close to me were not very supportive, but this was really different the second time around, meaning for my second abortion. So fast forward a couple years later, I have a job in reproductive justice. I know that I am able to advocate for myself at the clinic. I'm able to share my pronouns. I feel good about that. And I'm thinking that this is going to kind of make all the difference, right? But I was confronted with a lot of contradictions. I was still confronted with not having enough money to afford my abortion, even with the job that I had and with a maybe different level of access that I had, right? So abortions were not covered in my health insurance, and they wouldn't have been, right, because that kind of funding doesn't go towards abortion care support. And so I found myself still needing support, although I was advocating for myself at the level of like gender identity and pronouns. I was nervous about asking for like a support person to be with me. The doctor who performed my abortion, they didn't really humanize me. I didn't feel very listened to. And actually for the second abortion, I chose to go into the clinic for that follow-up appointment. And during the follow-up appointment, because of this experience of having 2 surgical abortion procedures, I knew that it was really important for me to have an advocate with me. And so I called the clinic, kind of using the connections that I had there to try to arrange a time for me and my partner at the time who's also a trans person, to be a part of that follow-up appointment with me. And so the clinic actually made it such that I was able to show up at that appointment with my partner. We weren't allowed to come like during normal business hours, but I was really grateful that like the access that I had like got me a different experience than I had for my first abortion. So after that first time, I realized the importance of abortion funding, and that's when I started to fund abortions. And what that looked like is folks would reach out to me in my community or on social media. They would let me know that they were Black or Indigenous, brown, trans, disabled, from the South, and navigating some really restrictive political and hostile political environments. And so no matter what the cost was or is, I like funded those abortions. And made it a little bit more possible for those folks to attend their procedures. So I share my abortion story with y'all because, well, first, RJ asks us to do that. And during the time that I was working for a reproductive justice organization, and it was my job to educate folks on the history and the framework of reproductive justice, this part about storytelling was always kind of inherent to that work. And so I have to start there. Also, I know that me sharing my abortion story, my reproductive justice story, it might make it a little bit more possible for someone else to share their story in the future. And that's also what I'm really hoping for as well. So I started with this reproductive justice story, right? My story. It includes abortion. And perhaps your reproductive justice story doesn't include abortion at all, right? But I'm also trying to like start from this place of decolonizing. And so I'm working with this organizing principle that Black folks in the South, Black folks everywhere call Sankofa. So this literally means to like go back, to retrieve. And it's been expanded upon by Black folks across the diaspora and in Black movement formations and organizing principles as a kind of going back so that we can go forward. So I believe that this political moment, these restrictive, hostile political environments that we're navigating and living in, they're asking us to do a little bit of this going back so that we can go forward. And so I'm starting with this kind of idea of Sankofa as a way to like structure my presentation. So kind of starting from this place of decolonizing, I also attempt to address why putting abortion and abolition in conversation makes sense, right? These concepts in movement and in framework, and in some ways values, are inextricably linked. And I hope to demonstrate that throughout my presentation. So we have to go back to both the history of RJ in the occupied United States, as well as the history of prison abolition in the United States. We also have to go back so that we can return to where these movements, their initiatives, and their priorities lie today. And then we have to go back so that we can actually imagine a future, a world where police and prisons don't exist, a world where reproductive justice can actually be achieved, and where abortion will be accessed. So I'm starting here at this kind of RJ history. So y'all know the history. Y'all might remember the early 90s. Of course, I was born in 92. So I can't speak from a place of I, but in reflecting critically and researching for so many years and educating folks on this history, I know to go back to the early 90s. So I know to pay attention to what women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, Native Pacific Islander and Asian women are doing, who are in their communities doing reproductive health, rights, and justice work. I know to pay attention to what they're doing. And I also know to pay attention to what's happening in a different way as it relates to what's happening in the 90s. So in kind of other political realms. So focusing more on that history of RJ though, I know that there was this really important conference, right? In Cairo, where women of color, they knew that they had to kind of center storytelling, center this social justice, racial justice, reproductive justice framework to be able to articulate on an international scale kind of what women of color, what people of color were dealing with in the occupied United States. navigating birth control restrictions, navigating mass incarceration, and also things like abortion access at the time. They recognized that the women's rights movement led by and representing middle class and wealthy white women could not defend the needs of women of color and other marginalized women. So we are already seeing this kind of departure and a centering of like the most marginalized as it relates to this particular point in the history. So they named themselves Women of African Descent for Reproductive Justice. So reproductive justice combines reproductive rights and social justice. And 3 years later, in 1997, the first reproductive justice nonprofit was formed to create a national multi-ethnic reproductive justice movement with all of these things in mind. So I mentioned that we needed to pay attention to some of the other things happening in the 90s, right? So as a trans person, a Black person living in the South, I'm also thinking about Don't Ask, Don't Tell, right? So Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a defense directive which directed that military applicants were not to be asked about their sexual orientation. Y'all remember the 90s, right? The Clintons were pretending to give a damn about Black people. They also were pretending to give a damn about LGBTQ folks by appointing the first openly gay ambassador in the late 90s. There was the Defense of Marriage Act, right? So it establishes marriage as an institution between a woman and a man. That was happening in the late 90s. Hate crime legislation is a carceral feminist goal. So it was a goal to address violence against women, kind of a goal that would bolster the prison industrial complex itself. So carceral feminisms, right? They require police and legal interventions, and they ignore the race that, or the ways, excuse me, that race, gender, class, immigration status leave certain women more vulnerable. And so I'm really nervous about things like carceral feminisms today, but also back in the 90s, kind of as this framework is taking off. As it relates, excuse me, to state-sanctioned violence, we're also seeing things like the beating of Rodney King. We're seeing the LA riots. Again, the Clintons, as well as other Democrats, are perpetuating this really anti-Black, anti-immigrant crime bill of 1994. There was the Violence Against Women Act, right, that allowed, again, the prison industrial complex to receive billions of federal funding and other kinds of funds to incarcerate people from our communities. And again, there was this proliferation of carceral feminisms as an answer to the oppression of women. So I just want to give a little reminder, right? Reproductive health, rights, and justice, they're all different. So for health, I want us to think about the individual service delivery. We've heard from some providers at this point in the conference. I want y'all to think about reproductive rights being abortion advocacy based on the US Constitution. So here I'm specifically thinking about the medical industrial complex as a limiting factor because of things like the medical and institutionalization of birth, as well as the medical industrial complex role in things like the forced sterilization of Native people, of Black and Brown people. And I'm also thinking about the Constitution as a kind of limiting factor, right, to reproductive rights, acknowledging that the Constitution didn't really make space for folks like a lot of y'all, like folks like me, folks that I'm in community with. And so I have really, or I'm nervous about kind of relying on this Constitution, relying on Roe even. So justice, right? Justice is supposed to be different. It uses organizing, intersectionalities, plural, and a human rights framework to advance its principles, different from health and rights. So RJ is important for a lot of reasons, but it's important because some of us, right, because of systems and structures, we're made to feel like we're not deserving of basic humanity. And so RJ is important because it amplifies the lived experience of poor people, undocumented people, Black folks, trans folks, disabled people, people who live in rural places, and also young people. There are these principles, these core principles. We've heard a lot about them. And I'm concerned that these principles are framed as rights. And I rely on these principles as an organizer, as someone who's interested in folks in my community and beyond learning about the reproductive justice framework. So the first kind of core principle that's framed as a right is that people, they should have the right to decide if and when they will have a baby and the conditions under which they'll give birth. Very important. 2, people have the right to decide if they will not have a baby and their options for preventing or ending pregnancy or gestation. 3, that the parents who exist, right, they should be able to parent, they should be able to parent the children that exist with the necessary social supports in safe environments, in healthy environments, without fear of violence from individuals, the government, and the environment, right? So I'm thinking here about how something like a hurricane or a snowstorm impacts abortion access, but also something like police violence and white supremacist violence impacting people's abilities to make self-determined decisions for their family, themselves, and their bodies. And there's this 4th expansive point around decolonizing sex and pleasure. So kind of articulating that, you know, before settlers arrived to, you know, how we understand the United States, people, indigenous people, African people, they were always already doing things like gender, medicine, birth, abortion, taking care of the land, education, work, right, and care in ways that are like actually unrecognizable to white supremacy and the systems and structures under it and affirmed by it. And so we have to kind of get back so that we can go forward. I believe that this third and 4th principles are kind of the most expansive principles for reproductive justice. And they are ones that I really rely on as an abolitionist. So I want to hone in a little bit here on what is a right? What's a right? So rights as an adjective, it is a moral good. It's justified, it's acceptable, legal entitlement to have or obtain something or to act in a certain way. When it's a noun, legal, social, or ethical principle of freedom or entitlement, fundamental normative rules about what is allowed of people or owed to people according to some legal system, social convention, and ethical theory. So as a Black trans person who lives in the South, I'm really worried about who is left out when we rely on rights as our sole kind of avenue towards freedom. I have questions like, who is left out of these ethical, social, and legal formations? And what other hegemonic, white supremacist structures do rights and rights frameworks affirm? So these are some of the realities and contradictions of human rights, right? During the Trump administration, the president at the time, he withdrew from the Human Rights Council. Also, human rights don't and can't become implemented in the US until they are implemented through local, state, and federal law. And a lot of us know firsthand just how hard those kinds of policy changes are. So it's important that we look to the human rights level as well as the national and international levels when we're thinking about human rights. And sometimes in repro spaces, either the national or the international gets really blown up. So I wanted to kind of highlight some things as well about the current administration and human rights. So Biden, folks are saying that he is continuing most of Trump's divisive and controversial policies and practices. We can specifically think about the left's, the Democrats' kind of marginalization of refugees and the way that their harmful policies impact Muslims and African people. So why isn't over-policing understood as a human rights violation? Why isn't the existence of prisons a human rights violation? How can we get our communities what we need without rights? These are rhetorical questions that I have. So I'm not the only person, right, who's kind of weary of these rights, right? Like, I'm not the first like Black feminist to say that we should be kind of nervous about rights and kind of nervous about what is available to us when we only seek legal strategies. So human rights discourses have been critiqued by women of color and by feminists for a really long time, as well as abolitionists. And so feminist scholars and abolitionists, they point out some of the inherent failures of human rights. So one of those failures, right, is that human rights laws are written in extremely masculine terms. The Universal Declaration, of Human Rights declares that women and children are uniquely entitled to special care and attention. Yet we live in a country where women and children are caged in places of incarceration. Trans scholars, furthermore, have included more gendered critiques of declarations of human rights to also uphold heteronormative nuclear family structures, right? So human rights laws often kind of reinforce these ideas that marriage and families should be nuclearly between men and women. And these kinds of things harm queer and trans people. Human rights are also, I'm weary of them, right? Because the laws and policies haven't historically prioritized women, people with uteruses, and trans people. And men, cisgendered white men from developed countries, they primarily get to determine the terms of equality. So police and prisons enact violence on our bodies as well through the criminal legal system and through systems of surveillance. So here I want to share some historical examples of reproductive oppression. And I'm hoping that many of the things on this slide are actually really familiar to y'all. So I'm thinking about the lack of access to hormone replacement therapy and other types of gender affirming medical interventions as these points, historical points of reproductive oppression. I'm also thinking about the lack of information provided to trans families who want to have children as matters of reproductive oppression. The treatment for HIV and other sexually transmitted infections or diseases is separated by the gender binary in terms of care. So what I mean here is that there are often support groups for transgender men or transgender women. And often it is the case that non-binary folks who are trans, they don't find that support that they need. Because of this, I think someone referred to it in a different panel as this like cultural insistence on the binary, this cultural reliance on the binary, which also of course harms trans folks. Historical examples of reproductive oppression. So this incoherent state violence against Black people. There are too many instances to count, right? Abortion bans, the existence of pipelines, deportation and detainment of immigrants, trans death and suicide, because it's not a trans issue, right? It's a societal problem. Transphobia is a societal problem. The existence of crisis pregnancy centers located near and in communities of color, forced sterilization, and the Flint water crisis. All examples of reproductive oppression. So reproductive justice, it recognizes a few things, but there are two things that I think I want to point out here, and they are that controlling people's bodies is the pathway to controlling entire communities, right? So here, I think it's important for us to not only pay attention to abortion bans, but also attacks on trans folks. I think reproductive justice says that we should pay attention to because we take this serious. Also the criminalization of protesting or protesters and activists, that is on the rise, as well as this rising enterprise of the practice of medicine within corrections. And so here I'm specifically thinking of the medical boards that are kind of housed within the departments of public safety and the departments of corrections that permit things like the shackling of pregnant incarcerated people and permit things like trans people being housed in facilities that are not correlative with their gender identity and sexual orientation. And so I also know that one of the things that I'm paying attention to as an abolitionist, as an organizer, right, is that fighting white supremacy is vital for achieving reproductive justice. And so I know that it cannot happen without that. So how do we do reproductive justice? We have a roadmap, right? So focusing on intersecting oppressions is one way, analyzing systems of power in order for all people to live self-determined lives is another way, and centering the most marginalized. So one of the ways that I appreciate, or one of the reasons I appreciate the reproductive justice framework is because it allows for, right, who the most marginalized is to shift from issue to issue. But what's important here is this kind of centering and recentering. So to bridge the gap for these histories, these traditions, these things that I want us to consider between abortion access, reproductive justice and its history, and then prisons and the prison industrial complex and abolition, I want to use two examples. So the first one is, of course, this example of Marissa Alexander. And so I'm going to play this short video for us. To make it big.
Marissa Alexander is a survivor of domestic violence from Jacksonville, Florida.
I apologize.
Marissa Alexander is a
I have it here. Sorry about that, y'all. I will share the video with y'all through the WOVA app a little bit later, specifically from Survived and Punished. And it is a 2-minute video on there. Here, no, that one's 17. This one. Okay.
Marissa Alexander is a survivor of domestic violence from Jacksonville, Florida. 9 days after giving birth to a premature child, she was confronted and threatened by her abusive estranged husband. In self-defense, she
I'm gonna
fired
pause
a
it.
warning shot.
Are y'all able to hear that? I'm worried that we're not. And so it might maximize our time to keep going instead of sharing the slideshow from there. Could I get some verbal feedback?
No, we're not able to hear it.
Thank you. So what I'll do, y'all, is share these videos through the WOVA app. So I was planning on lifting up Marissa Alexander, as well as my friend Keynote Address Brown. And what I wanted to kind of lift up through the sharing of their stories is kind of this, these campaigns, if you will, right? That could bridge the gap between abolition and advocating for reproductive justice. And I believe that some of the strategies used by the folks who advocate for Keynote Address Brown, as well as the folks who supported Marissa Alexander and her release, I believe that we can learn a lot from those campaigns and from those tactics. And so I'll share more about that soon. So in terms of bridging this gap, I want to kind of transition us into talking more about the history of policing and prisons in the US. So from 1619, I want y'all to kind of consider chattel enslavement as kind of dictating a lot about what policing looked like in the occupied United States, in America at the time. So it was kind of, things were oriented from this idea that people are private property, and that property deserves to be protected. And so we need some kind of entity to do that work. So insert the slave patrols, right? So these patrols were about getting minority communities to not only police themselves, but to also kind of affirm that, again, people were considered private property. These slave patrols were trying to make sure that organized groups of enslaved people would not rise up. And so these patrols really relied on white fear. And I would argue that the criminal punishment system today relies on a similar or the same kind of white fears. So policing after 1619, it looked more like this kind of Night's Watch model. Perhaps folks have heard about that. So some of the important things about this particular model are that they were, it's a for-profit model, right? So it was a volunteer situation, it was part-time. Some people believe that, you know, folks who were not very reliable sought out to be police because it was a way for them to evade military service and also kind of be punished for kind of doing wrong in the community. So some of the first instantiations of the police or police departments that we have or that we see come from Boston, occupied Boston, way back in 1636. So New York, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Baltimore, these are all other places where these police structures continue to grow. And I am pointing these places out as an abolitionist because these are also places where, right, today, modern day policing are informed by things like the Israeli Defense Forces and some really gnarly and scary entities that are interested in punishment and control. So it's no like surprise to me that like where the first police departments popped off, this is also where we see like a real proliferation of the departments themselves. So by the 1840s, all major cities had police departments. And the focus was about social control, making sure that folks stayed in their place. So in the South, it was about like kind of preserving notions of slavery. In the North, right, it was about making sure that Black folks, enslaved folks who came from the South were still kind of put into their place politically, socially, economically by things like the Black codes, but also Jim Crow. Again, enforcing this kind of social control, also enforcing the laws of the state. It was driven by economics and by politics like it is today. It was ineffective. And again, folks were kind of doing this as a way to evade or to take responsibility or punishment rather for kind of doing wrong. So as an abolitionist, as a person who lives in the South, I'm also really interested in these historical geographies of policing, right? So I'm interested in how formations of policing, prisons, and even abortion access look different as you cross that like border, that Mason-Dixon line. They're all borders, right? So in cities in the North, you know, we're still seeing this idea of this collective good, preserving these like socially conventional ideas. And in the South, again, to reiterate, we're really seeing policing and prisons used as this preservation of slavery. And so I'm really nervous, right, about some of those present day implications. So this is a map of the prison industrial complex. So we go from these scrappy hodgepodge, volunteer-based like structures of people to a really institutional model that grows with the help of a lot of other different institutions. So when we think about abolition of prisons and police, like in order for prisons and police to be abolished, a lot of other shit has to be abolished too. I'm really clear of that. So the prison industrial complex is a term that we use to describe the overlapping interests of government and industry that use surveillance, policing, and imprisonment as solutions to economic, social, and political problems. So this definition's from Critical Resistance. They're kind of a hub of abolition, both for theory and praxis. And it's a really great starting point. So abolition, right? Like the first time I heard about abolitionists, it was when I was learning about the movement to free enslaved people in the occupied United States. I heard about these white people, primarily like religious leaders from the South, who were good and sought out to like free the people that were enslaved. So these current day implications of abolition are hopefully a little bit different than that, and like some of those ideas are the same, right? So we take the name abolitionist purposefully from those who called for the abolition of slavery in the 1800s. Abolitionists believed that slavery could not be fixed or reformed, and that it needed to be abolished. And as prison industrial abolitionists today, we also do not believe that reforms can make the prison industrial complex just or effective. And our goal is not to improve the system, but to shrink the system into non-existence. And so when I'm thinking about the pathway that reproductive justice gives us kind of towards or even alongside abolition, I'm thinking about how abolition asks us to consider how things are and consider like also how we might want things to be, especially as it relates to abortion access. So I work across, within, and through, alongside a lot of different abolitionist and reproductive justice formations, and some of the values, right, that have informed that reproductive justice work and that abolition work has been literally and theoretically centering those inside prisons, so that other folks who are confined can actually understand that we're confined. And so one of the ways that prisons operate, right, is it goes really far to try to show us that people who are incarcerated in all different types of places of incarceration, whether that be like psychiatric institutions, but also things like juvenile detention centers and immigrant detention centers, right? They function on this idea that the people who are inside of them are completely separate and confined, unlike those of us who are on the outside. But as an abolitionist, as a person living under the Mason-Dixon line and kind of inheriting all of those, living in a society where that has inherited all of those histories and traditions from chattel enslavement, I know that there are ways that like we invite that confinement and that surveillance of the prison industrial complex into our lives, our homes, our work, our jobs, our family structures, our relationships. And so some of the other values say that all resistance is righteous, so as to not like yuck any yums, right? So in terms of prefiguring and imagining this other world, it's really important to like brainstorm and get a lot of things out there on the table so that we can find the way forward with each other. Care is a value of the work, right? Increasing communication between folks inside jails and prisons and outside. That's really important. And then building a quality legal infrastructure informed by those inside and outside. So I'm not the first like reproductive justice organizer to kind of care about abolition, to try to bring it into the conversation. I think that Dorothy Roberts, who's someone that we all should be very familiar with, I am also looking to folks like her for my vision or my ideas about abolition. And she writes that today's carceral punishment system can be traced back to slavery and the racial capitalist regime it relied on and sustained. And so I'm thinking about abortion access, and I'm thinking about capitalism, right, as a structure that also must be abolished, as well as prisons and police. I'm thinking here about what Dorothy Roberts says and writes. The expanding criminal punishment system functions to oppress Black people and other politically marginalized groups in order to maintain a racial capitalist regime. and that we can imagine and build a more humane and democratic society that no longer relies on caging people to meet human needs and solve social problems. So when was the last time that a police officer or a jail ever increased abortion access for people in your community? For me, these issues, like after I consider not just the things that folks like Dorothy Roberts writes, but also folks like Marissa Alexander and also Kanataka, when I consider their stories, it is clear, the way forward is clear to me. So abolition is also very clear to not conflate reform and abolition. So abolition is community accountability, a living wage for all people, community safety, affordable housing, universal health care, free abortion access. So when Dorothy Roberts writes for a number of publications, but here I'm thinking specifically about that dissent piece in 2015, when she's writing and advocating and talking about the ways that like women of color activism wins, and it takes this departure from the kind of pro-choice antics of the day, she talks about the ways that women of color, that people of color are talking about not just access to birth control, but affordable housing and universal health care and free abortion access, as opposed to reformist policies and initiatives. Things like reforms, these are these ideas that many of us might be swayed by, like a creation of women's prisons and jails, the existence of juvenile detention centers, body cameras, solitary confinement, as well as the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And then I'm thinking here about trans pods or housing units for trans people that some people imagine will help trans people be safer, right? So we want for prisons to be abolished. We don't want the police to get our pronouns right when they're detaining us. So I'm really inspired by the work of organizations like URGE, abortion funds, again, in the South, reproductive justice organizations in the South, who are making these very salient connections, both during 2020, last summer, right? And before then, right? These calls for defunding the police and abolishing the police, they go beyond the violence and the justice and the resistance of last summer. So defunding the police is about like investing and divesting, right? So fund abortion, not the police. That's one of the ways we can like divest those funds. Defunding the police is local, right? So the way that I'm doing it here or working with others to do it here in Western North Carolina, it might not work for my homies in the Triangle, right? Or my friends in occupied Ohio. Defunding the police is also about disarming the police. It's about also community-derived visions of safety. So I listened in on a workshop this morning that was about the kind of growing violence, the sonic violence, but also the like material, sonic violence is material, the other types of material violences that happen like from anti-choice folks and protesters at the clinic. And I was listening to folks talk about how the police in a lot of those situations, it turned out that they weren't very helpful and that they made a lot of people feel unsafe. So I'm thinking about these community-derived visions of safety to again, give us a way forward. Specifically, I'm thinking about defunding local police budgets, centering those inside, centering those who are the most vulnerable amongst our issues, thinking about the ways that we're all confined, critically interrogating how we welcome surveillance like into our lives, into our workspaces, into our relationships, right? So you can't bail someone out of jail if you don't talk to your housemates or talk to your family, right, when you go home. It is just kind of silly to think that like we can show up and be abolitionists without like trying to take care of people too, and without realizing that like abolition is something that like starts with us, and it starts like where we are and at home, and it also like starts in our reproductive justice organizations as well. So defunding the police, like reproductive justice, it's about opening lines of communication, but also closing the gaps. So filling in the places where the state fails us. Defunding the police and reproductive justice organizing, it ought not perpetuate and expand the prison industrial complex, right? It is about direct support. It is about mutual aid and the giving of condoms and the funding of abortion and the building of power. It is about all of that. But it also is about getting people out of jail and resisting the creation of jails and detention centers. It's about fighting for reproductive justice and implementing community accountability to address harms. It's about ultimately naming the end of police and policing as indicative of when reproductive justice will be achieved. So we are all like participating in this amazing conference because we always are already like using this RJ lens to do our work. And I just think we need to be more intentional about it. So centering and recentering storytelling, like I've attempted to do here today, but also empowering those storytellers, like the ways that we testify does. Fighting stigma and shame. Again, shout out to URGE and other organizations that are really committed to busting abortion stigma and providing ways that we can show up like without using anti-choice language to get our pro-choice points across. This is certainly the time to sharpen your analysis. If you are a reproductive justice advocate, you have got to use gender expansive language. I urge you to use gender expansive language and get with it, folks. We've got to stop relying on the cops to address the violence that happens at abortion clinics. We need to divest from police and invest in abortion, redirect those funds. Also, we've got to engage in local harm reduction work. So the folks in our local communities who are supporting pregnant people, who are supporting people through mutual aid praxis. We should use direct action in our campaign work. We don't have to reinvent the wheel with how we defend the clinic or with how we counter protest some really fucked up shit. We need to be connecting systems of oppression to marginalized identities. This is the time, again, sharpening that analysis, making it very plain for the folks in our communities. We've got to address how systemic issues make it hard for individuals, communities, and family to make decisions. So again, returning to this RJ framework. We do that by highlighting safety as derived from what our bodies need and what our communities need. We highlight abortion access discourses that go beyond Roe versus Wade. We highlight community-driven models of safety and alternatives and solutions. We might refrain from the expansions of the prison industrial complex and or working with police and the state. Consider who you and your organizations or your organizing is accountable to. Perhaps it's not people inside cages right now, but perhaps it's folks who are seeking abortion access in a very kind of hostile political environment. And we build coalitions that bring reproductive justice, rights, and health along. So the last thing that I wanted to kind of share with y'all, let me stop doing this here. I wanted to share a few kind of points in conclusion. And that's actually a quote from Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Let me get back to my Zoom. Okay. She writes, abolition is about abolishing the conditions under which prisons became the solution to problems, rather than abolishing the buildings that we call prisons. And so here, y'all, I'm thinking about the ways that abolition is an invitation. It's really an opportunity. Abolition, like we've heard from some of the previous speakers, it is about imagining a different world, a world where all people are free to make decisions that will impact their lives. and the lives of their family and the lives of people in our communities. In our reproductive justice work and in our abortion access work, let us continue to center and look to the margins for our way forward. Let us rely on existing networks of support like abortion funds, like clinic escort formations, and abortion doula collectives. Let us take serious the urgency of the moment, and let us learn from the lessons of the past to inform a new future where Roe might not be able to save us. Thank you.
Ash, that was absolutely amazing. Wow. Thank you so much for your words. As you can see, the chat is blowing up. If anyone out there wants to reach out to Ash for more wonderful words of wisdom, please reach out through the Hoover app that you all are, that we're working through. And just, wow, thank you again so very much. I hope to see you all in the breakout sessions, and yeah, let's keep this going. I'm uplifted now. I'm awake, so I hope you all too. So thank you so much. Take care.
Thank you.